They said she died, shot clean through the gut, left for the buzzards in a canyon that didn't have a name. It was easier that way for everyone. No need to chase ghosts or ask questions when a woman like Nora went missing. Folks in town only whispered about it once, then let the wind carry her name away. But Nora wasn't dead, not even close. She was crawling, bleeding, dizzy with the stink of sweat and iron. Her dress was torn to shreds. Her hands were raw from clawing at dirt and stone. Her knees ground down from miles of crawling through dry brush. In her mind, God, her mind was split open like a cracked window, letting in everything she didn't want to remember. She should have died out there. Maybe part of her had. 2 months before, Nora had walked through town with a steady gaze and a husband on her arm. His name was Clay Granger. He was a cattleman with sharp eyes, a clean mustache, and money that always smelled too fresh. He didn't beat her, not with fists, but with silence. He'd look through her like she wasn't there, touch her only when he needed to show someone else she belonged to him. And Nora, quiet as ever, let him, because Clay had pulled her out of a worse life. And for a while, she believed that was enough. But Nora had a secret, one she couldn't share with anyone. Not the neighbor lady who offered her pies, not the preacher's wife who offered her pity. No one, because if the town found out where she came from, they'd have buried her faster than that canyon ever could. See, Nora wasn't born in no fancy place. She came up in a trading post run by a man who didn't ask questions and didn't want answers. Her mother was a laundress who vanished one winter. Her father, well, she didn't know who he was, just that he wasn't around. She'd grown up scrubbing floors, serving whiskey to ranch hands twice her age, learning early how to smile when she was scared. One night, when she was 16, she disappeared too, sold off like livestock by the man who called himself her guardian. That was the first betrayal. When Clay found her years later working in a dry hotel near Abilene, she didn't look like someone with a past. He liked that. She said little, worked hard, and had a face that looked like it hadn't yet learned how to be cruel. So he married her. But Clay wasn't her savior. The world he brought her into wasn't clean. Behind the new curtains and pressed sheets was a different kind of rot. Men came around with ledgers, and ledgers didn't always line up. Women who knew too much stopped coming by. Clay's brother, Levi, had once run guns south of the border and now showed up on Sundays with blood still on his boots. Nora knew something wasn't right. She didn't know how wrong it would get. It started with a letter. No name on it, no return mark. Just a thin, curled piece of paper slipped under their door during a dust storm. It said, "Yours now, but I remember what you cost." Her hand shook for hours after reading it. Clay didn't see the note. She burned it in the stove before he got back, but something in her shifted after that. She started dreaming about faces she hadn't seen in years. About the man who sold her. About what she'd done to get away. And soon after, Clay started watching her more closely. He'd touch her elbow just a little too tight. Ask questions she hadn't answered in years. Where'd you say you were born again? How come you don't talk about your family? What was your name before it was Granger? Then came the night they rode out to the canyon. He told her they were heading out to check on some stray cattle. She didn't ask why they went so late or why he packed 2 shovels. She just climbed up on the horse like she always did, obedient, quiet. But her heart had started to beat faster than normal. She could feel something coming. And deep down, she knew he was going to bury her. But it didn't go the way he planned. There was a struggle, blood, a rock at her hand, a shot that missed. Then silence. She didn't remember falling, just the cold of the canyon floor. And how the stars stared down like they'd always known how this would end. Only it didn't end. She survived on rainwater and cactus pulp, crawled until her nails cracked and her mouth turned to sand. She thought about dying every night, but something kept her moving. Maybe it was hate. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's last whisper. Don't ever let them finish you. 2 months passed before she limped into town. The dress hung off her like it belonged to a ghost. Her hair was tangled with dry blood. Her skin was gray from dirt and the sun's cruelty. No one knew who she was at first. not even the sheriff. Then someone screamed, because Nora Granger had been buried by rumor, and now she stood on Main Street like a phantom with fire in her eyes. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared down the man who'd sold her to Clay Granger all those years ago. Walt Hensley, owner of the post where she'd been raised, traded, discarded. He was fatter now, slower, but his eyes were still as mean. He backed away from her like she'd brought hell with her. And maybe she had. The day Nora walked back into town, something shifted. Not just in the people who thought she was long dead, but in the ground itself, like it knew a reckoning had come. She didn't go straight to the sheriff, didn't cry out for justice or beg for help. She went to the edge of town, to the old boarding house run by Miss Lottie Marks, and asked for a room in a voice that was almost gone. Lottie didn't recognize her either, not at first. But something in Nora's eyes, hollow, heavy, and quiet as a grave, made her stop asking questions. She gave Nora the attic room and a hot bath, and didn't mention the way her hands shook as she washed the blood from her palms. That night, word spread like wildfire. They called her the ghost bride, the woman from the canyon, the wife who came back for vengeance. Some locked their doors. Others waited to see what she'd do next. But Nora wasn't thinking about revenge. Not yet. She was thinking about who else knew. Who had helped Clay, who had stood by while she was marched to her own grave. She needed names, and she knew just where to look. First was Esther Carr, Clay's old flame and still the richest widow in town. Esther had once called Nora a pretty little mistake, the kind of woman men marry when they stop thinking with their heads. But Nora remembered the way she'd looked at Clay, possessive, bitter, like she still believed he belonged to her. And now, with Clay missing, Esther wore her grief too neatly. Her black dress was pressed clean, her veil just long enough to hide the fact that she didn't shed a single tear. Esther came to the boarding house on the second morning. She brought soup, said kind words, and tried not to flinch at the sight of Nora's sun-scarred face. "People are saying all sorts of foolish things," she said, setting the tray down. "That you were left for dead. That Clay did something awful. But I know him. He wouldn't." Nora didn't answer. She just watched her spoon the soup like she was waiting to see if it'd burn her. Esther kept talking. "He told me once that he pulled you from nothing. Saved you. You should remember that." That was the first time Nora smiled since she'd returned, and it wasn't kind. Next was Sheriff Boone Carter, a man with a star on his chest and a history long buried beneath his polished boots. Boone had once been friends with Clay, rode cattle trails with him when they were just boys. But now, he looked uneasy every time someone said Clay's name. He asked Nora if she wanted to file a report, if she needed protection. She said no. She needed something else. "You ever wonder what really happened out there?" she asked him quietly. Boone blinked. "I figured you'd tell me." "I might," she said, "when I know I'm not the only one with something to lose." Boone didn't answer right away. He just tipped his hat and left, but not before she caught the way his hand hovered over the pistol at his side. That told her plenty. He was scared, not just of her, but of what her story might unravel. Then there was Asa Darnell, the town's doctor and a man far too soft-spoken for the things he'd seen. He'd treated Clay more than once for knife wounds and busted knuckles, never asked questions. Nora remembered the way he'd stitched up her arm 2 years ago when Clay accidentally slammed a door too hard. He hadn't said a word about it then, just looked at her with tired eyes and bandaged the wound like it wasn't the first time. Now, Asa was the only one who looked at her like she was still human. "I thought you were dead," he said plainly when she came to see him. "I was," she said. "Almost." He offered her tea and a quiet place to sit. Didn't ask for her story. Just said, "If you ever need somewhere safe, I still got that cot in the back." That meant more than any promise of justice. But the most surprising visit came from Levi Granger, Clay's younger brother. Levi had always been the darker shadow between the two. Where Clay wore charm like a clean shirt, Levi wore anger like a second skin. He drank hard, fought harder, and once set fire to a barn just to watch it burn. But he never lied, not the way Clay did. And when he saw Nora alive, he didn't look shocked. He looked guilty. It all started to come apart the night Esther Carr's house went up in flames. The blaze lit up the dark like a second sunrise, swallowing the sky in red and black. Folks rushed from their beds with buckets and blankets, but it was too late. The whole place was gone in minutes. Esther made it out, but just barely. Burned along her shoulder, coughing smoke, eyes wild with something that wasn't just fear. She didn't look at anyone, just kept repeating the same words over and over. He was in the walls. He said he'd come back. The town whispered that she'd lost her mind, but Nora knew better. The fire wasn't random. It was a message, a warning. Someone had been hiding in plain sight, and now they wanted everyone quiet. Esther had gotten too close to something or someone, and now she was marked. Sheriff Boone came to the boarding house the next morning, hat in hand, sweat under his collar. He didn't ask permission to come inside, just shut the door behind him and stood there staring at Nora like she was the one who set the match. "He's not gone," Boone said finally. Nora tilted her head. "Clay." Boone nodded, voice low. "We got word. Stagecoach out of Junction stopped for repairs." Passenger matched his description, only he was going by the name Riley Parks. Had a girl with him too. Young. Mexican, maybe 17. Scared out of her wits. Nora's throat tightened. He's already starting over. Boone sat heavily in the chair across from her. That fire. It wasn't meant for Esther. It was a distraction. I think he was here, watching. Nora's skin crawled. She thought she'd gotten out of hell, but hell had never let go. And now, the stakes had changed. It wasn't just about what Clay did to her. It was about what he was still doing to others. She wasn't his only victim, maybe not even his first. She asked Boone what he was going to do about it. He didn't answer. That silence told her everything. The sheriff was compromised. Maybe he always had been. Clay had his hooks deep in this town, and whatever Boone was trying to protect, it wasn't justice. It was his own neck. That night, Nora lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and the memories came fast, like storm winds rattling loose windows. She saw Clay again, standing in that canyon with the shovel in his hand. The way his voice went flat when he told her to dig. She remembered how he hesitated, not with guilt, but calculation, like he was choosing the cleanest way to get rid of her. And behind him, in the shadows, another shape. Someone else had been there. She had forgotten that until now. It hadn't just been Clay. There was someone standing behind him, watching, a flash of a dark coat, broad shoulders, a gold ring on one hand, and boots, polished, too fine for a place like that. Nora sat up, heart thudding. It was Walt Hensley, the man who'd sold her. She confronted him the next morning, marched right into his shop with dirt still on her boots and rage in her voice. "You were there," she said. That night, Walt's hands trembled just slightly as he adjusted a rifle on the shelf behind him. "Don't know what you're talking about. You watched him bury me," she said. "You let him do it." "I ain't done nothing to you since you left," Walt muttered, avoiding her eyes. "You sold me like cattle," she hissed. "Then years later you sold me again, to him." He looked at her then, not with regret, with something colder, like she was just another problem to be handled. "I did what I had to," he said. "Girls like you don't get clean slates. You got bought, you got sold. That's how the world works." But Nora wasn't that girl anymore. "You should have made sure I was dead." She left before he could say another word. But she knew now. Clay hadn't acted alone. Walt had been part of it. Maybe others too. There had been a network built around her silence, and her survival threatened to tear it apart. And someone was already working to make sure that didn't happen. The next betrayal came from Levi. He showed up at the boarding house, bleeding from the lip, smelling like whiskey and gunpowder. Claimed someone tried to jump him in the alley. Said he needed to lay low. Nora let him in, let him sit on the floor with his back against the wall like an injured dog. And for a while, she believed he might actually be on her side. But then she caught him going through her things. Found him with her old letters, her torn-up journal, and a small silver locket she hadn't worn since before the canyon. "What the hell are you doing?" she snapped. Levi didn't flinch, just stood up slow, that Granger look of half remorse, half defiance clouding his face. You think I didn't know what you were planning? He said. You think I'd just sit back while you dragged our name through the mud? Your brother buried me alive, she spat. And you helped him. Levi's jaw tightened. I didn't help, but I didn't stop him either. That was all she needed to hear. He left, but not before warning her. You keep digging, you're going to find something you can't put back in the ground. Nora's heart was past breaking now. It was hardening into something sharper. She thought she was coming back to expose a man, but she was pulling the mask off a whole town. Then came the final twist, one she never saw coming. Lottie, the boarding house owner. Quiet, kind Lottie who never asked questions and always offered tea. She came to Nora one evening with red eyes and trembling hands. Sat at the foot of the bed like she'd aged 10 years in a day. I have to tell you something, she whispered. And what she said made the blood drain from Nora's face. Lottie had once worked at the same post where Nora was raised. Before it became a trading hub for outlaws and broken deals, it had been a halfway point for orphan girls too old for charity and too young for marriage. Lottie had been one of them. She'd escaped barely. She'd built a life here, far away. And she had known who Nora was the second she saw her. I didn't say anything because I thought maybe you'd finally gotten out, Lottie said. But then Clay came, and I knew. I should have warned you. I should have told someone. But I was a coward. Nora just sat there, numb. It had all been circling back. This place, these people, they were all tangled in the same rot. Different faces, same wounds. And now, Clay was back on the move. The girl he'd taken with him was just another version of who Nora had once been. And if she didn't stop him, it would happen again. And again. The stakes weren't about her survival anymore. They were about stopping a cycle that had gone on too long. Nora stood in the mirror the next morning, wrapping her hands in cloth and tying her hair back. She didn't look like a ghost anymore. She looked like a reckoning. She wrote one letter, gave it to Lottie with instructions. If I don't come back, she said, send this to the marshal in Abilene. He's not part of this place. He'll listen. Then she took her father's old revolver, the only thing Walt ever left behind that had any use, and went to find Clay. Not to beg, not to threaten, but to end it, once and for all. It all came undone the way old rope snaps under weight. Loud, sudden, and beyond fixing. Nora didn't ride out of town quietly. She wanted them to see her. She wore her scars like a warning and her father's revolver at her side. The sun was just rising over the hills, but there was already dust on the horizon. Proof Clay wasn't far ahead. She wasn't the same girl he left in a shallow grave. She wasn't hunting him for justice anymore. Justice belonged to lawmen and papers. What she carried was older, bloodier. She was there for the truth, and if it meant crossing a line, she'd burn the whole map. But before she could reach the river fork where Clay was last seen, she saw smoke in the sky. It wasn't from his camp. It was from the church. She turned back, heart-dropping. The town's old chapel, the only thing left from the time before settlers carved up the land, was burning. Not just a fire, but an angry, fast-moving one. By the time she got there, half the roof had collapsed. Boone stood outside with a bucket in each hand and no clue where to throw the water. Townsfolk were scattered, some crying, others just staring. And in the middle of it all was Levi. He wasn't helping. He was yelling. She did this, he shouted. You let her come back here and poison everything. Nora stepped down from her horse, voice low and cold. You think I'd burn the one place I ever prayed for peace? Levi turned to her, face red and wild. You brought this curse on us, Nora. It was quiet before. You stirred up ghosts. No, she said. I gave them names. That was the moment it all cracked open. Boone dropped the buckets and drew his gun. Not at Nora. At Levi. You set the fire, didn't you? Boone said. To keep her from finding those church records. You knew. Levi laughed. A dry, bitter sound. You think this is about papers? That building was rotten like the rest of this town. Just like you, Sheriff. And then it all came out. Boone and Clay had been running a quiet little business for years, taking bribes, covering land theft, turning a blind eye to the girls brought in and sold off as wives or servants. Levi had helped move them, claimed they were helping, claimed they were saving them from starvation. But none of it was charity. It was all about money and control. And Clay was the one who built the network. Nora didn't blink. She had suspected it deep down, but hearing it out loud still made her sick. Esther Carr appeared at the edge of the crowd, eyes shining with tears that weren't grief, but fury. She walked straight to Levi and slapped him hard enough to knock him sideways. "You sold my land to them," she whispered. "You promised it was clean." Levi staggered. "You weren't supposed to know." Boone tried to intervene, tried to talk sense, but it was too late. The town had heard. Whispers turned to accusations. And then the real betrayal came. Lottie, trembling, stepped forward. In her hands was a ledger, so old the cover was falling off. She'd hidden it years ago behind a wallboard in the chapel. It listed every name, every transaction, every girl who passed through the post, through Clay's hands, through Walt Hensley's deals. And some of those girls had never been seen again. "I didn't know what to do," Lottie said softly. "I was scared, but not anymore." Boone's face turned gray. He backed away slowly, muttering that he'd fix it, that he'd talk to the judge, that he hadn't hurt anyone directly. But the crowd was closing in, and he knew it was over. Nora didn't even look at him. She turned to Levi. "You saw what Clay did. You stood there when he left me to die." Levi didn't argue. "I want him gone, but not like that. I thought maybe if I just stayed out of it." "You let it happen," she said. "That's the same as doing it yourself." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and something cracked in his expression. But it was too late for apologies. Esther walked away. Lottie turned her back. Boone tried to ride off and was stopped by the blacksmith, who threw him to the ground and tied him with a length of his own rope. The town had reached its boiling point, and there was no going back. Nora could have stayed. She could have watched them tear each other apart. But she had one more thing to do. Clay. She followed the river fork north, where he'd last been seen, with only the sound of hooves and wind at her back. The sun dipped low. Birds grew quiet, and she found his camp just before nightfall. There was a fire pit, a bedroll, and the girl. She was sitting beside a tree, knees to her chest, eyes swollen from crying. She looked at Nora the way a cornered animal might. But Nora just knelt and held out a hand. "It's okay," she said. "I'm not him." The girl didn't speak, just pointed into the woods. Nora stood, took the revolver from her belt. She found him near the water, crouched by a creek like he still had time to wash the dirt off. He turned when he heard her, and for a moment, he looked like the man she married. Same lazy smile, same eyes that had once convinced her he could never be cruel. "Nora," he said, "you're alive." She didn't speak. "You don't understand," he said, rising slowly. "They were coming for me. I had no choice." "You had every choice," she said. "You just chose yourself." He took a step closer. "I still love you." She shook her head. "No, you don't. You just missed the silence." He tried to reach for her. The gun was already raised. "I didn't come here to watch you run again," she said. He looked at her then, truly looked, and something in his face twisted. Rage, fear, maybe both. "You're not strong enough to kill me." She didn't reply. The shot rang out and echoed through the canyon. When she came back to the girl, the sun was gone. She gave her food, warmth, and a promise. "No one will ever sell you again." Back in town, things weren't the same. Boone was taken in chains by a federal marshal Lottie had wired 2 days prior. Levi disappeared, his brother's blood on his conscience. Esther sold her land and left. Walt Hensley's shop mysteriously burned down. No one rebuilt it. And Nora? She stayed. Not because she forgave the place, but because someone had to tell the story right and make sure it never happened again. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the one who survived. The moon sat heavy in the sky the night the truth clawed its way out of the dark. Everything had led to this. Burned chapels, broken friendships, secrets scratched into ledgers, names whispered behind closed doors. But truth didn't come clean. It came with blood under its fingernails. Clay was gone. Nora had made sure of that. She'd buried him herself, deep, far from the road, where no other girl would stumble across his camp or fall under his smile. She didn't say a prayer. She didn't need to. He wasn't the kind of man who earned prayers. But killing him hadn't ended it. If anything, it opened a door. When she returned to town, the air was thick with tension. Word of Clay's death had traveled fast. Some folks called her a murderer. Others said she should have done it years ago. Either way, silence wasn't an option anymore. The town had been cracked open, and what spilled out was uglier than anyone was ready for. 2 days later, the girl, her name was Rosita, testified to the marshal. She told everything. How Clay had found her in a border town, promised her safety, swore he had land and a wife who would help her start over. She believed him because when you're starving and scared, even the devil sounds like salvation. What he gave her instead was cold hands, long nights, and a threat behind every smile. She wasn't the first. She'd seen pictures in his bag, photos of other girls, names written on the back in careful script. Some looked like they were sleeping. Others didn't. Her story broke something in the marshal. He sent riders to surrounding counties, orders in hand. Names were matched. Families were contacted. By the week's end, 6 missing girls had been linked to Clay. But it didn't stop with him. The ledger Lottie kept told a wider story, one that stained the whole county. Dozens of trades, some from decades ago. Girls passed off as indentured workers, as wives, as help. Signed off by men who wore badges, sat in churches, ran stores. The people turned on themselves. Boone, locked in the town jail, was nearly hanged by a mob before the marshal's men stepped in. They moved him in the dead of night, along with 2 others, landowners who trafficked in girls like cattle. Levi Granger didn't flee far. They found him just outside Riverton, drunk, muttering to himself about Nora, about Clay, about how he tried to stop it, but no one listened. He went quietly, like he knew he didn't deserve anything else. It should have ended there, but the town still wasn't done bleeding. Esther Carr, who had been silent for too long, spoke at the town meeting in the square. Voice shaking, she told the crowd what Walt Hensley did to her when she was 14. How he taught her obedience with locked doors and bruises. How her father sold her debt to him in exchange for cattle. The crowd went dead still. Walt had been dead 2 days, stabbed in his own shop by an unknown hand, his body left with a piece of torn ledger paper stuffed in his mouth. Esther didn't cry. She didn't blink. "I ain't sorry," she said. The marshal didn't arrest her. He just nodded, and the meeting moved on. And yet, through all of it, Nora felt herself unraveling in a different way. She'd gotten what she came for. Clay was dead. His name was blackened. Others were falling with him. But there was no peace in it. She stood by the river one morning, watching the water move past without stopping, and realized she wasn't whole. She wasn't healed. She had cut out the infection, but the wound was still deep. Rosita came to her that same day with a folded paper. Nora's letter to the marshal, the one Lottie had promised to send if she didn't come back. "You don't need it now," Rosita said. But Nora wasn't sure, because now that Clay was gone, a deeper question haunted her. Who was she without the story of what he did? Her whole reason for surviving had been to make it known. And now that it was known, she felt hollow. That night, she dreamed of the canyon. Only this time, Clay didn't speak. She did. She told the girl in the grave to get up. Told her that her name wasn't just a footnote in someone else's ledger. When she woke, her hands were shaking. The next day brought the final turn. A young woman arrived from Amarillo. Said she was looking for her sister, gone 5 years. Said she heard whispers from a dying man in Riverton who mumbled the name Clay over and over before he passed. Nora took her into the back room of the boarding house, poured tea, and listened. The girl showed her a photograph, small, creased, and Nora felt her breath catch. The face in the picture was the same as one of the girls in Clay's bag. The girl was never found. Nora didn't cry. She just folded the picture and placed it on the mantel. Later, she sat alone in the chapel ruins, just her and the ashes. And that's when Lottie came. "You did everything you said you would," Lottie said quietly. You gave them names. You burned the silence." "I didn't save them all," Nora whispered. "You saved one," Lottie replied, meaning Rosita. "Sometimes one is all we're meant for." But Nora couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough, that she hadn't finished what she started. That's when she made the hardest choice of all. She left, told no one where she was going. Just left a letter on Lottie's desk, one for Rosita and one for the marshal. She wasn't running. She was chasing something else. She was going to find the rest, the other girls, the ones never counted. She was going to tell their stories. Not with guns, with truth. Because the world didn't need more revenge. It needed memory. She took nothing but a small satchel, her revolver, and the photograph. The last line of her letter to Lottie read, "I won't stop until every girl who was lost is remembered by name. I came back from the grave once. I won't let them stay buried." And so she rode out alone into the gray light of morning. Not as someone's wife, not as someone's victim, but as the one who remembered. The road Nora took out of town was long and empty, the kind that swallows footsteps and keeps secrets. She didn't look back, not because she didn't care, but because she did. Some things you leave behind, not to forget, but because they've already shaped who you are. Back in the town she'd left behind, the dust didn't settle so much as shift. The stories she cracked open kept spreading. Letters arrived from other towns. Women wrote from distant counties, names long whispered in sorrow, now spoken in anger. The truth had caught fire, and it kept burning. Boone never made it to trial. On the way to the county seat, he claimed he was sick and needed to relieve himself in the woods. The deputies let him, and he shot himself behind a tree with a pistol he'd hidden in his boot. The note they found on him was short. "I thought I could live with what I did. I was wrong. His death didn't bring peace, but it brought quiet. Levi Granger lived, but barely. Prison didn't want him. The law couldn't quite stick charges to him beyond aiding and abetting. So they released him, a broken man who walked with a limp and drank from sunup to sundown. Folks saw him talking to himself on the edge of town, sitting outside the burned church, muttering names like they were ghosts. He wasn't punished by law, but life did the job for it. No one looked him in the eye anymore, not even the crows. Esther Carr stayed. She reopened her father's old shop, not to sell, but to house women passing through with nowhere to go. She didn't speak of Walt, not again. But people knew, and that was enough. It brought her bread, cloth, tools. She never asked. She just kept the doors open. Lottie became the soul of the town. The chapel was never rebuilt, but she turned the ruins into a garden. Planted lilacs and wildflowers among the ashes. The ledger stayed buried under stone, just in case anyone tried to forget. Rosita left 6 months later, not because she wanted to run, but because she was ready to begin again. She went north, carrying a new name and a letter from Nora. The last thing she said to Lottie was, "She made me believe I could live." And Nora? She kept going. She tracked down a farm in Missouri where 3 girls had been seen years ago. One was married now, never told her husband how she came to be there. Nora didn't force her to, just gave her the name of the marshal and a promise that no one would ever shame her into silence again. In Kansas, she found an old woman who remembered Clay from years before, said he'd lied about his age, his past, even his name. Said he once claimed to be a preacher's son. The irony made Nora laugh, bitter and sharp. By the time spring came, she'd filled a journal with names. Not just victims, but people who had helped, hurt, or watched and done nothing. She didn't call it justice, just truth. But not everyone wanted truth. One night, at a roadside and outside dodge, a man tried to shoot her, called her a liar, said she ruined his brother's life. She took a bullet through the shoulder, but she got him first. The barkeep swore it was self-defense. No one questioned her story. Still, she felt the weight of it long after. She wasn't untouchable. The work she did cost her sleep, blood, and whatever peace she thought revenge might have brought. But she never turned back. Years later, people would say they'd heard of her. The woman who remembered. The one who survived the grave and made a life out of ruins. Some called her a saint, others a ghost. But the truth? She was just a woman who stopped waiting to be saved. And maybe that was the most ironic part of all. Clay thought he'd buried her to silence her. Instead, He gave her the voice that would bury everything he built.